Hello, my name is Hannah Bronstein, and I'm in the elementary education program at NC State. This is actually my second time around with Screenomatic, so I'm hoping that it all works out. The book that I read was called Other People's Children, Cultural Conflict in the Classroom by Lisa Delpete, and I originally got interested in her as a writer when I read an essay of hers last semester called Skills and Other Dilemmas of a Progressive Black Educator. And her book is mainly a compilation of essays and anecdotes that she has written along the way of her academic and professional career. The book mainly examines racism, multiculturalism, power and privilege in education, specifically in teaching and teachers' education programs. And the essays are actually on a very wide range of topics, from her time in Papua New Guinea to her thoughts about assessment in teacher education programs. So there are a lot of ideas that you can find in the book, but the ones that I chose to focus on were the culture of power that she talks about, and she defines this in a couple of ways. First, she talks about how power isn't actually in the classroom through the teacher and the teacher's code and rules of expectations for the children in terms of language and behavior and academic success. But she also talks about the institutional culture of power, the curriculum, what the students are learning, how they're expected to show what they learn. And she states that being explicitly told the rules of the culture of power makes acquiring power easier. So, for example, she talks about children who speak what is considered non-standard dialects of English. And she says that when they are given direct, explicit instruction in the conventions of standard English, it helps them to succeed in an academic context where standard English is expected. And she also states those with power are frequently least aware or least willing to acknowledge its existence. And she talks about this a lot in terms of the conversations that occur or do not occur in teacher education programs surrounding race, which I'll talk more about later. Next, she talks, as I said, about her experiences in Papua New Guinea and Alaska, and she talks about the communities there, the diversity of them, as well as the approaches to education that are working and not working in these communities. And this quote is, "The practice of literacy, typically a solitary endeavor in academically oriented Western societies, can also promote alienation in communities that value collaboration and interaction." And this quote is addressing a situation in Native Alaskan communities where white educators were moving away from round-robin style of reading in the classroom to individual reading. And they were doing this as a result of academic research on the subject. However, in classrooms with Native teachers, they were having the students read collaboratively as a group. And this showed that the Native teachers had a better sense of their community's values, their community's uncomfortable feelings about doing an activity individually. And it also underlies the anecdotes she tells about Papua New Guinea, in which the community had concerns about the school being a source of disconnection from their students' society and their home community. And she talks about schools that incorporated these concerns and were value-based schools rather than schools of academic skills. So they taught, instead of math or reading, they taught the history of the community values, and then the students matriculated out of the school into the academic school. And the parents in Papua New Guinea and community members were very pleased with this because it created young people who weren't at odds with their community values. So it's a very interesting anecdote, and if you have time, you should definitely read about it because it brings up a lot more issues than I'm able to put into this short presentation. Next, Delpy talks about connecting curriculum to experience. The greatest asset in the student's possession, the greatest, moreover, that ever will be in his possession, is his own direct and personal experience. And she talks about a lot of, I thought, very interestingly simple ways to achieve this. So she talks about creating math problems where when she was a teacher, she would put in the names of the students into the math problems so that math problems were about the students in the classroom. Or a Native Alaskan teacher who taught his students to calculate distance by speaking about the village in which they lived. So she talks about a lot of little simple ways to achieve this, but she also talks about greater, creating an entire curriculum that is based in the history of the students, in their cultural background. So she really emphasizes the need for students to be understood by their teacher, the need for the teacher to know their culture, know their background, know their references, and make the teaching relevant to their lives. Next, she talks about teacher education, as I stated before, and this was a portion of the book that I found really interesting. She talks about the statistic that 40% of our nation's students are non-white nowadays. However, only 10% of the teacher population is non-white, and that population is actually shrinking. And she speaks about some conjectures as to why this is occurring, and one of the reasons that she feels this is happening is teacher education programs and the failure of teacher education programs to take in multicultural perspectives, to have honest and open dialogue about issues of race. Throughout the book, Delpy offers the direct comments from students and professionals who express a lot of similar frustration with racism in teacher education programs. And they talk about the lack of open and honest communication between themselves and white educators or white students. They also talk about having to learn from academic research studies that were very negative about their own community and the conflict they felt between their community and what they were learning in teacher education programs. Delpy suggests a couple of modifications to teacher education programs that she hopes would alleviate some of these problems. She says that there should be a portion of the program that requires students to interact with the community and hear from community members about their opinions about education. She also suggests that students should work in groups in which there's a diversity among the members of the group, and so they can hear from diverse perspectives and incorporate some different teaching methods and styles into their own teaching methods in order to best serve diverse populations of students. Some suggestions for teaching: maintain awareness of variations in dialect, narrative styles, and attitudes of the populations represented in the classroom. At one point, Delpy mentions how white middle-class teachers often prompt their students to follow rules through questions as a way to exert power in a non-direct manner. And actually, the next morning, a student walked up to me and said, "I broke my pencil." And I said, "Well, then what do you need to do?" And then I immediately thought, well, I didn't need to phrase that as a question. I could have just said, well, then go get a new pencil out of the green basket, which is the classroom rule. So it kind of prompted me to think of those instinctual reactions that come from your culture that you don't even think about, which may not be best serving students who come from a different background or different culture, who might appreciate a more direct statement rather than questioning. She also suggests working to create a multicultural curricula that educates children to the differing perspectives of our diverse population. And to conclude, I'll leave with this quote: "To provide schooling for everyone's children that reflects liberal middle-class values and aspirations is to ensure the maintenance of the status quo, to ensure that power, the culture of power, remains in the hands of those who already have it." And lastly, I'll recommend this book to anyone who has some extra time to read a whole book. I know that might be a little unlikely, but I think it's really important because it brings up a lot of information that otherwise I'm not sure I would have ever thought about, and it brings up very important issues for educators going forward with the increasing amount of diversity in our country today. Thank you.